Okay, first of all, this week is, as it says, is the golden age of German Jewry. Next week will be on a different subject, and the week after that, being the Tisha B'Av, on the ninth of Av, there will be no HHH. We will then look at it as to what will be happening in August. Now, today's subject is the golden age of German Jewry. Now, the expression golden age has occurred many times in Jewish history, the most famous of which would be Spain, where one always heard about the talking about what was the golden age of Spanish Jewry. It was a wonderful age where Jews lived a wonderful life and everything was absolutely great. And there were periods again in Germany, as we'll come to, which is viewed as a golden age. And some people would say that we, more of our sort of age, of anybody who lived maybe through the period prior to the last 10 years, have lived in a golden age here in England. But this is an expression which can be used by different historians at different times in different ways. None of them are completely true. The idea of a golden age of Spanish Jewry is, as a historian would say, was greatly tarnished. There was golden, but it was tarnished. And it was more likely to be true as a golden age of a few individuals. In reality, history records individuals. It doesn't, as one said, it doesn't deal with the cleaners, it deals with major personalities. So if you think that these major personalities had a golden age, so that leads to the idea that there was a golden age. Now, Germany is varied, complex, and complicated. And we have to view the period which we're dealing with, which is prior to the First World War, a period between the 1880s and 1914, without alluding to, without considering, and as if we never knew what was going to come next. Because if we know what's going to come next, that, of course, influences how we think of the past. And many people would view whatever happened in the past as a precursor of what would come in the mid 20th century. So we are looking at events as if they don't know what's going to be happening, and we don't know what was going to be happening. Now, in the period prior to the First World War, Germany was considered by many to be economically and militarily the most powerful nation in Europe and actually seemed far away from war. Children begat children who begat children in Germany, and the permanence of this arrangement seemed to give families the idea of that there was exceptional land in the Reich, and it seemed absolutely assured. No one could think that it wasn't going to continue. In fact, there's a wonderful work by Dubnov, the historian, which I have in two volumes. And in his second volume, at the end of it, he says how he's talking about the history of the Jewish world. He's writing in the early 20th century, and he quotes, paraphrasing, that he can see absolutely no reason why, with a Jewish population of around 16 million, things will not continue in that way. He can't see any possibility of things changing. How wrong he was. Nonetheless, Jews did live in a gilded cage. Now, let me just read to you just a bit which you haven't got, but I have, is from Risa, who was Gabriel Risa, who was elected vice president of the National Assembly of Frankfurt, is one of the most outstanding personalities of this period of German history. And he was discussing about legislation about the Jews in Germany. And he stated, under just laws, Jews would be the most ardent patriots of Germany. They will become Germans along with us, as well as among Germans. And it led to this idea, which we all know so well, is that the Jews in Germany were more German than the Germans. And they truly loved living in Germany, and Austria to a certain extent as well, in this Reich. This was the ideal part of Europe. There was nowhere quite like it. Now, any anxiety which existed through age-old anti-Semitism didn't crush the overall belief in the goodness of what Germany would be, it was becoming, and will become even greater in the idea of German culture, which was known as Bildung, which is the German term for betterment, for ethics, and for education. This ideal society, this ideal ethical world, which was part and parcel of this German culture. But it is good to remember that nonetheless, despite all the advances in Germany, all the advances of German Jewry, there were areas where Jews could not get. They would not be allowed to be. And this is essentially in the upper echelons of society. So there was no way that Jews would to be at the top of the political tree. If you mute yourself, please. At the top of the political tree, and they could not rise however well they did. And there were a lot of Jews in the army. However well they did, they couldn't get to the top of the tree. Can you mute yourself? Yet Vienna, which was the most important center of German language, of theater, of art, literature, music, admired by the world, was invariably promoted and supported and created in many ways by Jews. Interestingly, for those who have been to Vienna and have studied and read about Viennese Jewish history and history, one of the major mayor of Vienna was someone known as Karl Lueger. And Karl Lueger, who there's a monument to him, there are statues to him, he was a fabulous mayor and he did a lot for Vienna and he's honored because of it. But he was also a virulent anti-Semite. What is interesting about this society where people maybe didn't like Jews quite so much, nonetheless, he as an anti-Semite had Jewish friends. And somebody remarked to him, well, how is it you've got Jewish friends? You don't like Jews. In fact, you hate Jews. And Lueger famously stated, I will decide who is a Jew. So in his eyes, if you were a Jew and he liked you, it didn't matter. Now, Germany, more than Austria, was more orderly, more law-abiding, and many Jews saw little of anti-Semitism and any Jewish problem. They were in a world where Hanukkah became Christmas, where Shabbat, which in many eyes was called out on a Sunday. And in the Frauenbund, which is the Jewish female movement, stated the following: these days, it is terribly hard to kindle in others the Ner Tamid, the eternal light. But that is our duty. Today, Jews believe that they have the right to find their own way and need not, as in earlier days, submit themselves to moral prescriptions, to some sort of Jewish law. For someone such as me, who 40 years ago, innocent, bathed in the spirit of my parents' house, protected by my yichus, she uses that word, illustrious lineage, began my social work. It has been a frightful shock to the soul to discover that Jews too, in the last decade, have strayed from the line laid down for them. German Jewry was in free fall. German Jewry was collapsing. German Jewry was being eaten away. Now, German Jews, acculturated, absorbed German culture, which many will speak of Germany, where they would celebrate the birthday of Schiller or Kant more than they would Hanukkah, because this is what was important to demonstrate their Germanness. The German Jews began to have fewer children, which you get advances in society. Intermarriage rose between up to 30% in 1915. In Breslov, intermarriage rose to 52%. People only think, oh, people have only intermarried in the late 20th century. In Breslov, in 1915, that's 100 years ago and more, the intermarriage rate was 52%. There is an article by Eugene Fuchs, a well-known personality, who wrote in Deutschen Reich, 10 years ago, he said, I had already indicated that it was not the shape of the beard, the color of the hair, the curve of the nose, or the size of the body that was decisive, but the energetic, dedicated will to be a German. We are born into a German fatherland and on German soil. And that gives us the right to call ourselves Germans without baptism and the so-called assimilation. We are truly German. And went on to say, the Messiah, for whom we prayed for thousands of years, has appeared in our fatherland, has been given to us. The Messiah is freedom. Our fatherland is Germany. Deutschland is our fatherland. And that's how most German Jews of a certain type believed and felt. Now, at this particular point of time, Reform Judaism also naturally grew out. Shirley, could you cut off your screen? Reform Judaism grew. Judaism, therefore, diminished in the Orthodox world. Conversions increased. And baptism among men was 21% in 1918. And they're hoping for improvement in social acceptability. In the old subject, if we become more German, then we'll be more accepted. If we become more Christian, we'll be more accepted. If we take baptism, even if we don't really believe in it, we'll be more accepted, said Dr. Strasberg, who was in his memoirs. There's so much written by German Jewry, there are books on it. That's why it's so easy to quote and find letters referring to every single aspect of German Jewish history. Millennia, he says, of repression have not persuaded Jewry to convert, he says, but decades of considerate equality will be enough. And we've all heard this before. The reason why people leave Judaism is not because of suffering of anti-Semitism, but because many will say life is too good, it's too easy. At least, he says, equality will be enough in Germany to bring Jewry in essence to an end, not by conversion, because of the unfortunate prevailing lack of belief. The modern Jew, if he is not provoked by persecution, ceases to observe his religion, and as for his children, if they do not immediately convert to Christianity, their defection from Judaism is almost a matter of course, and further developments proceed quite naturally. He read, he saw, he wrote that it was inevitable that German Jewry was on the way out in many ways. There is a wonderful story to do with Wilhelm Klemperer, part of the famous Klemperer family. And he was a rabbi of Landsberg, the Orthodox rabbi of Landsberg. But as we've seen before throughout history, even in the golden age of Spanish Jewry, there were those rabbis who converted to Catholicism. His case, he didn't convert to Catholicism, but he wanted a job in Berlin. And in order to get approval from the authorities in Berlin, he didn't convert, he changed to become a Reform rabbi. On contacting his wife, he informed her that now I'm a Reform rabbi in Berlin. His wife, it is said, and went along with members of the famous Klemperer family. They went out into a non-kosher butcher shop, and at that moment, she bought pork sausages. One day, she'd been the wife of an Orthodox rabbi. Now she had seen herself in a different mode, and she bought pork sausages. And she writes about this occurrence as part of the mythology of the Klemperer family. There were those who said that even without all these things that went on in the mid-1940s and the ultimate Holocaust, German Jewry may well have disappeared. It just would have eaten itself by conversion, and by general disinterest in it, it would have gone away. Jews not only converted, but many married non-Jewish women, which ultimately happened as well. Kafka's wife was not Jewish. Martin Buber, the famous philosopher, the famous writer on the Hasidic movement, and you can read his books, married a non-Jewish woman. And it was said, quote, many of the best young Jews have wed non-Jewish women whose self-assured spirit they consider the personification of all humanitarian ideal. This was the way out. If you really wanted to move on, you wanted to find a good woman, you needed a non-Jewish woman, in the opinion of many. Jewish success continued on. There, if you go to Berlin and you see the major stores there, Tietz, KaDeWe or Kaufhaus der Westen, and Wertheim were all Jewish. Jews, as pictured on the flyer which I sent out, amongst others, we have a community of great people. Buber, Einstein, Freud, Arendt, Heine, Mahler, Mendelssohn, Marx, Meyerbeer, Schoenberg, Stefan Zweig, Rosa Luxemburg. The list goes on and on and on. And there were also a great number, of course, of famous rabbis, many of whom, such as Rav Soloveitchik and others, who would study at Berlin University, Humboldt University, and would study secular philosophy. These were the leaders of orthodoxy, but they studied secular philosophy at Humboldt University. By 1914, the Jews were less than 1% of the population. They were never more than 1% of the population. In fact, that didn't change. Even when the numbers went up, they still reduced as a percentage. Yet, it was a well-known quote, they were at that time 16% of the German Nobel Prize winners. So a population which was 1%. So this German Jewry that we're alluding to was phenomenally successful. It was unbelievably knowledgeable in many spheres and many areas. And it was known as Gershon Scholem. He described it as the one-way love affair. And what he was talking about was that German Jews loved Germany intensely, with absolute love, but it was not returned. There are many expressions, it's like a glass ceiling as well, it's referred to, but the one-way love affair by Gershon Scholem is the commonly held expression that where German Jews loved Germany, Germany did not love the Jews. And like all love affairs, it often comes to an end. There was a book, which we've never heard of, which nobody's probably ever read, and if anybody has, just contact me, was called Werther der Jude, Werther the Jew, an 1892 novel dealing with the identity crisis of assimilation and Germanism. It was so popular, it so fed into the heart of what it was to be a German Jew at the end of the 20th century and the beginning the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, that it went into many reprintings. And it is written about by Eugene Fuchs. In Deutschlandreich, which we've already looked at. So, some say that Walter Rathenau, the German foreign minister, who later on would be assassinated, was ill-equipped to deal with his Jewishness and famously wrote a piece called Hear, O Israel, Shema Yisrael. And this was by appealing to the Jews, get out of being Jewish, assimilate, just get rid of it all. But yet he would never deny his Jewishness. And it is said that when meeting Bernhard von Bülow, who was Wilhelm II's chancellor, who introduced him to the chancellor, that there, the foreign minister of Germany, Walter Rathenau, who is badly portrayed in a TV program about many different things. It's shown him kissing the mezuzah and having a menorah in his home. It would be completely unlikely, that it never would have been. But he would always introduce, despite all his problems, and known as a self-hating Jew in many ways, before he would have any conversation, he would go, Your Highness, I am a Jew. So he would announce that. In the TV program about Einstein, he is poorly portrayed as being some vigorously religious Jew. It wasn't so at all. Now, Gabriel Risa saw that mixed marriage was the ideal. Said there's a work called Der Untergang der deutschen Juden, which we'll come to, which is the downfall of the Jews. And this is by Felix Thalhaber, which you may never have heard of, but he is famous in matters to do with sexuality and sex when he was writing in that particular period. Wrote he, "The German Jews are a declining people. We have bought they have bought their emancipation and their acceptance as German citizens dearly through the sacrifice of their religious and national impulses, mixed marriages, baptism, abandonment of the community, diminution of the people through fewer births, physical and mental defects, increase in the mentality ill, suicide in an alarmingly increasing degree, and from nowhere is there any substitution or compensation. We are losing numbers, but they are not being replaced. Those who were coming in from Eastern Germany were hardly even considered and were looked down upon by German Jewry." Gabriel Risa, who we introduced before, the most prominent spokesman for the emancipation of Jews he said and encouraged mixed marriages. A consequence of our new law, he asserted, will be that marriages will be mixed. Religion will no longer be a permanent and insuperable dividing wall preventing a union of peoples. So we can begin to see the gradual movement of the subject of today is that we're looking at a community that is dissipating. Others, interestingly, saw the survival of Judaism through in a folkish manner. It's sort of going back to their roots as they were going. It was at the time in Germany as well, and through myth and tales of Hasidism. And they wrote and they studied the Hasidic world. And that they saw in Eastern Europe as a wonderful story. And it is said that people and bibliophiles in Germany collected volumes to do with the Hasidic world. One of the people who dealt in that was Moritz Steinschneider, who, again, most have never heard of. He was a cataloguer of Hebrew works, and he worked, in fact, at the Bodleian Library in Oxford. He was a magnificent scholar and a linguist, and he had one of the greatest collections of Hasidic works. He was approached by a student who saw his collection of Hasidic works, and he said to him, "My word, what a collection you've got. That is phenomenal. You as a German Jew, and yet you have this phenomenal collection. Have you read all that? It's incredible." To which he, Steinschneider, replied, "You don't expect me to read that nonsense." So even though he was a major collector of Hasidic works, he was a major writer on Hasidic works, he viewed it as nonsense. And Buber, who we've already found, spent much of his life studying Hasidism. So downstairs I have a couple of books by Buber on Hasidism. Now, Jews at this time joined political parties, and they formed what was known as the Central Verein, the Union of German Citizens of Jewish Faith. Note, it is not a union of German Jews. It is a union of German citizens of Jewish faith, and that is very different. Now, they were the largest Jewish body in the Reich, and they represented the Jews as much as they could. And they would stand up for the Jewish community, which they viewed as the greatest and the best in Europe. There was nowhere finer to be living as a Jew than in Germany. Despite everything I've said, despite everything which is discussed, despite everything which you read about, nonetheless, they would still view it in that way. For they saw, we're not like the French Jews who have to suffer over the Dreyfus affair, and we're not like the Russian Jews who have to suffer in the Pale of Settlement and the orphanage to do with pogroms and the czars and all that. And they would so much be standing up for what they believed in that they would be allowed to duel. Now, dueling was often not allowed by Jews because they weren't of the highest echelon in the armies or in the society to be allowed to duel, but they did on occasion, and they were rather good at it. Now, we are lucky. Franz Oppenheimer, the economist, said, we are lucky to be German. The central Verein, and many of these individuals we will touch on again later, the central Verein looked to women's rights as well, and aspects to do with women's health and reality. And one of the most famous, who we certainly will view again, and I'm sure many have read about, is the patient of Freud known as Bertha Pappenheim, and she was known as Anna O. As well as her, there were writers and poets. All in all, as we leave, the 20th century commenced and German Jews prospered. Of the 200 wealthiest Prussian families, 40 were Jewish. And that was, you can work out the percentage yourself. That was 20%. Of the wealthiest Jewish families in Prussia were Jewish, remembering that the Jews only represented 1% or slightly less than 1% of the total population. And synagogues now, those synagogues which we would have been lucky enough to have seen, and you have to see now in encyclopedias, were built to reflect success. So if you go into Berlin today, you can still visit the Golden Dome, which you can see from many different areas of Berlin, and you can see the result of enormous success and confidence. That's what large buildings represent. They represent confidence. We're here to stay and we're going to be here for a while. And that if you go to Oranienburgerstrasse, that great golden dome representing that enormous synagogue or temple, as it would have been known, with seating hundreds, if not thousands of people, was to reflect what they believed to be the ultimate best period of Jewish history, which was for them the Spanish Golden Age. Spanish Golden Age to a German Golden Age. And the synagogues, therefore, were often very Moorish in style, reflecting the architecture of their Spanish predecessors. Oranienburgerstrasse, interestingly enough, was not destroyed in Kristallnacht, which I'll be dealing with on Tish B'Av in North Italy Synagogue, but they were destroyed, nearly destroyed, partially destroyed by Allied bombing, which happened as well. But it was actually not destroyed and saved by local Germans, the police and the fire brigade, who didn't want it destroyed. So we end in German Golden Age, going all the way back through architecture to the Spanish Golden Age. Next week, we will deal with the subject of why Tish B'Av, or the 9th of Av, or the fast of Av, was something which was good for the survival of Judaism. And I leave you here today. I wish you all a very good day and have a wonderful week. Thank you very much.